I mean, most of my YouTube audience is going to be here in the chat anyway. So
you've got all your fans already
yeah.
around you.
Okay, so for those who are watching, then we're talking to Stephen Law today, who has authored Humanism, A Very Short Introduction, and we've read it as part of Mark Angliatelli's book club on his Discord server. And I guess we're just going to be having a general conversation today about our thoughts around the book and any kind of questions we've got, because we've got the author here as well to ask them. So does anyone want to kind of start with some comments on what they thought or questions for Stephen Law?
Well, I wanted to ask just a general question about target audience for the book. Why'd you write the book? What were you thinking about when you organized it into chapters the way you did?
Can you hear me okay?
Oh yeah, I think we lost, yeah, I think we lost you, and was it DJ Rausch just asked a question, the first question, sorry. Did you manage to catch that, or?
I think I caught the end of it. I think, so this is being a bit glitchy compared to normal,
okay.
But we'll carry on. It might help if I relocate, but let's just try this and see what happens.
Okay.
So I think I was asked about why I write the book.
Yes.
Yeah, who's the target audience? And,
and
like that.
I think that this will work better if I'm nearer the router. Just hang on a second.
Yeah, no problem. Technical difficulties, hopefully we'll be all right.
It's just a sneak way for him to give us a tour of his home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With the book.
Some other weird shit now. Okay. Right. This may be better.
Your connection looks a lot better. At least I'm receiving you much clearer.
Yeah. Okay. So so why did I write the book? Well, it's been a while now since I wrote it, so it's a little bit difficult to remember. But I seem to remember that I was actually asked to write this book by Oxford University Press. They wanted the book written, and I was contacted as somebody that would be an appropriate author. And then when I wrote it getting constant feedback from Andrew Copson, who is the head of Humanists UK and the International, or I don't know what they're called now, Humanists International, I think they've rebranded as, and also Ron Lindsay, who was running Centre for Inquiry, which is a secular humanist organisation in the United States. So they saw everything first draft, and then I would make some changes given their comments. That was the process, really. And I was invited to write the book, presumably because, you know, I'm reasonably well known in the humanist community, and they thought I could do the job. So.
And who is the target audience for your book? Who were you thinking about as you were writing this?
Well, the VSI, very short introductions, are all kind of aimed at lay people that are interested and want to know the basics, I think. And so that was what I was intending to do with this book, to make clear what humanism as the term is used by, you know, contemporary campaigning humanists, people that come together under that label in organisations like Humanists UK and so on, what they mean by the term. It was that I was aiming to explore, and it was that the Oxford University Press wanted a book about. So I just did my best to explain humanism from that perspective, and that's why I was constantly liaising with Andrew Copson and Ron Lindsay, just to make sure that actually what I was saying was reasonably accurate. And yeah, just to give people a feel for what it is, I felt that I had to include some material on religion and why humanists are not religious, why they reject a theistic outlook. So you get some of that in the book. But of course, there's an awful lot in the book which is looking at other things, positive views to which humanists sign up. Have I answered the question? I think
I think
Yes, thank you.
One question that I had in the book was maybe like two or three chapters, or a good maybe third of the book was almost dedicated to like theistic arguments. And I was wondering why this is such a key feature of humanism, the non-theistic element, you know, like historically humanism might be tied to some, you know, like if you've got like a Venn diagram of theism and humanists, you might say like there's a sliver somewhere in there that can overlap, you know, of people like Erasmus or whoever was teaching him, who might kind of come into both, you know, you might define them as humanists and theists. And I was wondering why so much was to do with these arguments against the existence of God.
Well, because I was explaining humanism as the term is used by Humanists UK and Humanists International and so on. So there's a very long tradition of using the word humanism in a variety of ways. And in fact, I think Pope John Paul II described himself as a humanist, for example. And the term is certainly used to refer to sort of figures, you know, in the Reformation and so on. They were, despite being religious thinkers, they were very much humanists. What did they mean by humanism? Maybe something along the lines of, well, humans should be at the center of our thinking, of our ethical outlook. We shouldn't be entirely focused on some other worldly issues. We should be very much focused on human beings. And there's nothing wrong with using the term in that way. That's, you know, that's one of the ways it's used. But it's not the way that the term is used by Humanists UK, by people like Andrew Copson, by people that campaign under that umbrella. And it's that term that really I was charged with explaining. So, and I said all of this out in the beginning of the book, I think, reasonably clearly, that, you know, obviously the book, the word is used in a variety of ways, but I'm just going to focus on this contemporary use of the term. So inevitably then, you have to spend a little bit of time explaining why we're setting aside theistic belief. We're either positive atheists or at least negative atheists. We're not actually signing up to any kind of theism, and that's an important part of the package. It's not an optional extra. And in fact, it's because we reject theism that we then reject moral systems that are rooted in theism or rooted in religious belief. And we reject political systems that are, you know, theocracies or rooted in religious authority and so on. So it plays a key role, this rejection of theistic and religious belief. And so surely you need to spend a little bit of time explaining why you're doing that early on. So that's what I did. Of course, many religious people who use the term theism in a looser sense, if they were to buy the book and not read the careful explanation that I provide at the beginning, they might feel somewhat aggrieved that, you know, I was somehow twisting humanism and turning it into something that excludes them, and that this is, you know, and it's, the book certainly shouldn't have a load of attacks on theism. And in fact, I did get comments like that. But, you know, from my perspective, that was just a misunderstanding on their part. The book was never intended.
I think that I had a similar question that Nathan had, and that was basically, you know, why it was concentrated on basically carving a space, making a picture of humanism in relation to theism. I thought that sometimes, you know, because you had a very limited space to write, I thought that I thought that although I could see that being as an important part of Humanist UK and the campaigns that they do for like religious schools and things like that, I was surprised to see that there wasn't reference to, but instead a picture that was based on kind of the compassion and where that came from. And for instance, with the history, I was surprised that because it was based on Humanist UK, that it did kind of this ancient history thing rather than, let's say, history over the past 100 years of the development of the humanist movement. And I think that featured maybe a page at the end of that chapter. And so I was certainly a bit surprised about the balance within this book in terms of arguments against God and also the way that the history was constructed. And I assume that you, like you said, you've had good explanations of why that was the case in terms of who was telling you to write it and what the perspective it came from. I think I personally would have preferred, as a member of Humanist UK, I personally would have preferred an image of humanism that was based as a standalone image, so not something that wasn't carved as a space to be outstanding from religion, but one that was just a separate thing altogether, that was its own entity. And I wanted the history to reflect that as well within the book. But of course, you're not writing to me, you're writing to a much broader audience. But
well, it's not a sort of bolt-on. The atheism is not a bolt-on optional extra as far as Humanists UK are concerned. And in fact, it's feeding into other political views that they take about, about morality and about the state. They reject theocracy, they reject religiously based ethics and so on. Why? Well, because they're atheists. I mean, unless you explain that and give some justification for it, you're not really doing their position justice. So you have to spend a little bit of time on that. Okay. That's what I did. I mean, I might have spent a bit more time maybe than other people would, because it happens to be a research interest of mine. I publish papers, academic stuff on theism and the existence of God, and for that reason, then you tended to get a little bit more, maybe, of that stuff just because it happens to be my thing.
Did you write the very short introduction for atheism, or for?
Was that Thingy Bigini or what?
Bigini, yeah, Julian Bigini wrote the one on atheism. That's right. And that's a good book too, actually. I recommend it. Very good. So so that's where I was coming from. The key point about the atheism is not an optional extra. This is a particular kind of humanism, the kind to which contemporary campaigning humanists sign up, and the atheism informs a number of positions to which humanists subscribe. So you need to explain why they are drawn to atheism, what the case is. And I also thought it was important that many people who are religious would be interested in finding out more about humanism. So it would be, they should at least have a sense of why humanists are rejecting the theistic perspective. And I gave what I thought were the most compelling reasons, really, for rejecting theism, certainly sort of the traditional monotheism. And in particular, I think that the evidential problem of evil, if you were to ask most humanists why they reject theism, that's probably going to be top of most lists. So you need to include that, and then I've got my own sort of take on that, the evil God challenge, which is a way of articulating why I think many atheists do find the argument really very compelling indeed. Many theists think that they can deal with the argument. They think they can diffuse it by various strategies, constructing theodicies or explanations for the evil, or by playing the mystery card and saying, well, God works in mysterious ways. Who are we to think that we could know the reasons that God might have for allowing the evil that we exist in the world? And I think it's important to give them a sense of why we just find that pretty ridiculous, most of us. And the evil God challenge does that. So that's why that's in the book.
I really especially loved that chapter. The problem of evil seems to argue against an all-good God, and that seems to be very compelling. Bart Ehrman's one of our favorites in that regard. If not an all-good God, why assume the opposite? Why is an evil God, except as a philosophical curiosity? Wouldn't a God that's moody or somewhere in the middle be the easier? I'm talking about from the other side.
I'm not, obviously I don't believe in an evil God. He's just a device that I've introduced to allow us to look at various arguments that are being used on one side and to show how you can mirror those arguments and those strategies more or less equally effectively on the other side. And yet, given that almost everyone thinks, including the theists, that belief in an evil God is absurd, then the question is, well, why should we consider belief in a good God any less absurd? That's really the evil God challenge. And so I need to focus on the evil God for that reason, because I'm using this analogy in order to try and, to some extent, I suppose, shock the theist, actually. I think that very often, when you're trying to deal with people that have a very entrenched position on something, and they've really spent a lot of time constructing intellectual defenses of that position, if you come at them straight ahead, they're ready for you, and they're going to get you bogged down in a lot of arguments very quickly. So, for example, if you're trying to debate a young Earth creationist, unless you are super well prepared, they are going to tie you in knots and probably make you look fairly foolish as far as their audience is concerned, because they're extremely well prepared. They know what you're going to say in advance of you saying it, and they have a whole script worked out, like a cold calling or salesperson script that will allow them to deal with whatever you say and at least create the impression that what they're saying couldn't be completely ridiculous. And if you want to deal with individuals like that have a very entrenched view, it seems to me that very often then the best strategy is not to just give the arguments that they're anticipating, but to kind of creep round the back and get them to look at other beliefs which they themselves consider absurd, and then to notice the very strong analogy between what they believe and the way in which they're defending their beliefs and what's going on over there, and clearly the absurd nature of what's going on over there, which they can immediately recognize, and then they're in trouble. Okay, so that's a good strategy when it comes to debating young Earth creationists, it seems to me. And it's also the strategy that I'm adopting with the Evil God Challenge. It's a way of trying to get theists to, just for a moment, see how they seem from someone else's perspective. So they can just for a second appreciate the fact that other people will be looking at their belief system from the outside, and they'll be thinking, this is pretty cranky, actually. And they themselves would consider the belief system cranky were they not already fully entrenched, fully signed up to it. And they can see that when they look at other belief systems, such as the Evil God belief system. So it's a kind of a rhetorical argumentative device, the Evil God Challenge. It's not just a kind of intellectual exercise. I've kind of adopted it because because I think it's a more effective rhetorical tool, if you like, and that's one of the reasons it's in the book. I've forgotten
Thank you.
Where did this comment start? I've forgotten. I completely lost the thread now. Sorry.
Anyway. You completely answered it and
Right.
exceeded my expectations. Thank you.
Thanks.
Have you thought much about, because I was thinking as I read that argument, a way that it could be used in productive conversations with theists who are particularly sort of entrenched in their beliefs or whatever, is you could kind of walk down this avenue of the evil God, and I think they would reject it based on the problem of good. And then you present the symmetry to the good God that they believe in. And then the differentiating factor, rather than it being reasoning, is essentially comes down to bias then. And then you can pull out that bias and say, yeah, actually, the reason why I'm accepting this one over the other one, when both have the same evidence for and against, would be, unless they, I mean, there was one thing, like I spent a while trying to figure out how you could make the Adam and Eve thing work symmetrically as well, because you said that was the one differentiating factor.
Like that. Yeah, it is difficult. They don't all flip, well, not all the theodicies flip particularly well. Yeah, actually, I just remembered what I was going to say in response to the other last question. I was going to add a point, which is that, yeah, I focused on an evil God because it's a useful analogy. But of course, there are many other gods that are on the table, and some are far more plausible than either the good God hypothesis or the evil God hypothesis. So, for example, you could go for a God that's neither all good nor all evil. We don't have any argument yet against that God, so far as the amount of good and evil that we see in the universe is concerned. And then another hypothesis we could consider is that there are two gods, neither of which could then be omnipotent, one of which is good and the other of which is evil, and they're involved in some kind of cosmic battle. Now that's a much better fit in terms of what we see around us, in terms of the distribution of good and evil. It's more or less what you would expect if there was such a cosmic battle going on. So again, we wouldn't have really an argument against that form of theism. That form of theism is Manichaeism. The Manichaeans believed in two gods, one good and one evil, involved in such a cosmic battle. And who was a Manichaean? Well, St. Augustine, before he became a Christian, believed in two gods, one good and one evil, involved in a cosmic battle. Of course, once you just go for that's a much better fit empirically, right? But it's less economical than just the one God. If you go for one God, you have the benefit of economy, but suddenly you've got quite a lot of explaining to do in terms of the observed distribution of good and evil. And that is, of course, why Augustine was particularly interested in trying to deal with that problem then. From his perspective, coming from the Manichaean background, you can see why that would have been particularly awkward. And so he spent a lot of energy trying to deal with that problem. Yeah.
Well, even in Christian monotheism, don't you have, not quite God, but Satan, and demonic forces, very powerful, that kind of acts as that dualism. But then the question has to be asked, well, why does God allow Satan as much free reign as he does?
Yeah, because that's not really the thing about Satan is his power is so very, very limited. He's up against an omnipotent, omniscient deity that can stop him doing whatever he's doing whenever he wants. This isn't a competition between two equally powerful gods. This is a single all-powerful God and some other insignificant speck that the all-powerful God is allowing to behave in the way that he does. So yeah, that's a different belief system, obviously, to the Manichaean one. And yeah, if you introduce Satan in order to try and explain some of the evil, you have some very obvious questions to answer, such as why on earth would God allow Satan to behave in such ways? Yeah. So, next question.
The U.S. has separation of church and state in our Constitution. The UK has state-sponsored religious schools.
Yeah.
That the U.S. has a much higher religiosity than the UK. Why do you think that is? And I have a follow-up.
Okay. Well, I'm an armchair theorizer, so I'm not well placed to. I can merely speculate on why that would be. That the United States is more religious. I guess it probably has something to do with the fact that the people that moved there were particularly religiously committed individuals, and that somehow carried on in a way it didn't carry on here. And I don't really know why. You'd need to ask some sort of social scientist. It's an empirical question, and armchair theorizers are not well placed to to answer rhetorical questions. I can only speculate. But yeah, it's true, of course. Yeah, in some way, America is an extremely secular country politically, and yet it's also one of the most religious countries in terms of numbers of people who believe. But that's changing very rapidly now, isn't it? I believe.
From some measures, sure. I'm uncertain. I'm not sure if this follow-up then makes sense given the speculative nature. If the UK got separation of church and state, or the US lost it, what do you think would happen in the religiosity of each country? Do you think that would influence it?
Well, if you really lose separation of church and state in the United States, and it becomes in effect a kind of theocracy, which many people would like, clearly, I don't know where that would end up. It would be a very frightening situation, and those that resisted it would probably be dealt with very brutally. You could end up with some form of civil war. I don't know. So looking to the UK, to the other half of your question. So if we do kind of, we're fairly secular, we don't have too much to complain about, but we do have religious schooling, state funded, and we do have those bishops sitting in the House of Lords who are able to influence political decision making. And there are other privileges that religion has too, but the situation is not too bad, Were we to become a bit more secular, then that would be the end of state-funded religious schooling. Would that have an effect? Possibly, but religious belief is going into decline very rapidly anyway. In the UK, it might speed that up. Possibly, it would make more of a difference for Roman Catholics and Muslims. It would have more of an impact there, maybe, because there are state-funded Roman Catholic schools and Muslim schools, and Jewish schools, and those communities rely very heavily on the state providing them with a religious school at the end of their road, or whatever it may happen to be. And if they lost that, they would have to either start their own schools privately and pay, and in many cases they wouldn't be able to do that, or they would lose a very significant chunk of the machinery that's holding their young people within theistic belief. My kids went to a Church of England school, but they're mixing with people from all sorts of backgrounds, and we're atheists at home, and whereas in other communities, your school and your family life and your culture, it's all saturated with the same religious belief, and that's an important mechanism when it comes to keeping people within the faith. And were a very significant chunk of that to disappear, namely the school side of things, that might pretty rapidly, well, that might increase the rate at which people are leaving those faiths. I guess. Again, I'm just speculating. I don't know.
Do you have any thoughts on the ties of sort of religion into some of the more elite and private education systems? So like Eton, for example, has lots of rituals and traditions that might be broadly conceptualized as religious, or, Oxford, the colleges are generally tied into chapels and things, or quite you've still got like Blackfriars or Wycliffe College or Cambridge, where it's very different to like Manchester University or something because of the kind of religious heritage. Do you think that almost that almost gives a kind of credence to something like Christianity in a way that like Mormonism isn't a plausible option because it isn't associated with like Oxford and Eton?
Yeah, that's certainly true. Yeah. You can, I mean, there's a lot. The church has traditionally had a great deal of money, and they've been able to buy themselves big chunks of, university provision, colleges and chairs. I think in terms of divinity, theology, there are way more chairs in that than there are in philosophy, for example, in Cambridge, and that's just due to the amount of cash available to religious institutions traditionally. That has significantly distorted what's going on in the university. And it gives religious belief a kind of respectability and at least a veneer of intellectual credibility that otherwise it wouldn't have. And of course, this is continuing today with the Templeton Foundation. Are you familiar with the Templeton Foundation?
Yes.
So John Templeton, extraordinarily wealthy person, dead now, but his foundation continues. They fund research into religious and spiritual matters with a kind of a science related dimension to it. They're interested in that kind of crossover area. And so they funded scientific studies into the efficacy of petitionary prayer, multi-million-dollar studies into whether or not prayer works. They do a lot of research, fund a ton of research at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, millions and millions of pounds being put in. That gives, I mean, if you're in philosophy of religion, you can apply for Templeton funding. If you're doing research that potentially threatens religious belief, forget it.
Okay.
You're not going to get Templeton funding. So highly unlikely, I think, that you would get it. They'll fund an atheist, but they're not going to fund an atheist like me, who is potentially going to come up with significant ammunition against religious belief. What they're looking for is to fund stuff that lends a bit of credibility to religious belief, that explores the positive side of religious belief, maybe the benefits that it gives communities, impact on health, stuff like they're going to like that. The extent to which science and religion are somehow compatible, they're particularly obsessed with that. And so it continues on. Templeton have really changed the culture so far as research in religion is concerned, and not entirely healthy way, I think. So, yeah, that's the way of which it's a, I mean, one of the things, I think this may be true, see what you think. Seems to me that when atheists find themselves having doubts about their atheism or coming under fire, their first port of call is to try and construct an argument, to look for evidence, to come up with reasons themselves to support what it is that they believe. Whereas very often the first port of call for a religious person is to go, yeah, but it can't be silly because look, that person over there that's really smart and is a scientist, they believe it. So see, it can't be absurd, can it? Pointing to people that appear very credible and have PhDs and so on and saying they're religious, it's a very effective way of reassuring yourself and other people around you that religious belief couldn't possibly be absurd.
Seems to me like that's what atheists are doing as well. So the way they would find reasons for their atheism is by pointing to these very smart atheists and being like, well, these person have arguments about why atheism is true, so obviously I must not be in the wrong.
Yeah, I think some of them do that, but I think that, I mean, maybe we should probably do a survey. Again, it's an empirical matter, isn't it? But it seems to me that it's much more something that religious people go in for. It's almost their first port of call when they start to have doubts, is to start. It's And in fact, it was noted, wasn't it, by Leo Festinger in his book on cognitive dissonance, When Prophecy Fails, very famous book about cognitive dissonance. He looked at people in cults that prophesied the end of the world, and then the date came and the world didn't end. What do you do under those circumstances? And you might think that, well, people will just drift away. But they didn't. What they did was they suddenly went on a recruitment drive. It became very important to them to bring more people in and surround themselves with more people who believe the same thing, because that provides a kind of reassurance and security blanket which protects them. And I think that you find a lot more of that going on. I don't doubt that atheists do it too, but it seems to me that you find a lot more of that going on within religions than you do within atheist communities. Usually, if you piss off an atheist, threaten their belief, they'll start arguing with you, and that's also true of many theists. But it's far more likely that the theist will start to, oh, but look at this smart scientist over here. He believes in God, so you see, can't be ridiculous, can it? They're more likely to do that, but that's my impression. Maybe I'm wrong. We don't know really until we've done a study.
See, I do that, but for everything else, I point to people rather than evidence. I find myself, I reassure myself to begin with, to shelter my worldview, the fact that there's some people that I really like believe the same things that I do, so I must, be okay, whether that be or whatever it is. I understand that's not a great epistemology, and there are better ways of doing it. But I do know I do that.
Okay, I mean, it's okay. I mean, pointing to smart people and saying, but they believe it too. This is an expert on something and he believes it. So, I mean, it's not that there's usually anything wrong with that. But right, when it comes to religion, we know that religion has an amazing track record of getting even smart, college-educated people to believe utterly ludicrous things. We know it can do that. There's almost nothing else that has that power, but religion can do it. Religion is capable of convincing 130 million Americans that it's good science that the entire universe is only 6,000 years old, for example. It actually, to be fair, it's not just religion, it's also certain kind of sort of conspiracy theory or supernatural theory. But these kinds of belief systems are particularly good at sucking in even the most intelligent and well-educated people, like, I don't know,
William Lane Craig.
yeah, no, I was trying to think of an example. So, well, who was the guy that invented Sherlock Holmes? That was, God damn it, I forgot his name.
Arthur Conan Doyle.
Arthur Conan Doyle believed in fairies. Really, really believed in fairies. Convinced himself that fairies were real. Was persuaded by two little girls who lived up north in a village called Cottingley that they had photographed fairies. He was completely taken in by the photographs. So, the fact is that when it comes to that kind of subject matter, that even the smartest and most intelligent of us can get quite easily sucked in and duped. And for that reason, then, appeals to the authority of people with PhDs look rather less convincing when it comes to defending religious belief, it seems to me, than something else, some other kind of belief, such as atheism.
So if we can ask you about your belief about God, you're pretty certain that there's no God, is that right?
Yeah, it depends on the God. I mean, if it's the traditional monotheistic God that's all powerful, all knowing and all good, yeah, no, it's ludicrous. Okay,
and you criticize agnosticism in your book as well. There's a bit there, I mean, I can't remember what it says, but I remember it was...
Agnosticism, yeah. What do I say about agnostics? Well, I think I say, I mean, it's often an attractive point of view, isn't it, to say, well, on the one hand, but on the other hand, I'll sit in the middle, I'll sit on the fence, and that makes me look kind of reasonable and so on. There's a fallacy, it's even got a name, I can't remember what it is, the fallacy of the middle position or something. I mean, clearly that's not a good strategy when it comes to, depicts the cliched example, Nazism. You know, I'll be a bit of a fascist, and you know, I'll be anti-Semitic on 3 days a week, and not. You know, clearly that's a middle position, but it's completely unacceptable. I think that there's an overwhelmingly good case against the Judeo-Christian God, and I don't think people should be agnostic about that.
Think there's anything that could change your mind, something that happened or something, some evidence that could be brought to you that would change your mind?
Yeah, I mean, if I die and end up meeting the big G, that's obviously that'll be a bit of a shock. I'm fairly confident that's not going to happen. Let's hope not, because I'll be going to the other place almost certainly.
Yeah. So nothing while you're alive that would change your mind. No,
it may be that somebody could come up with some fantastically good argument. But boy, it's going to have to be good, because it's going to have to be strong enough to overcome the very significant case that can be made for saying there's no such God, just by looking around us at the sheer quantity of pain and suffering that exists in the universe.
Okay. So I would consider myself agnostic, and my issue with being an atheist or a Christian, I go back and forth, is that I'm not entirely sure we can ever know whether, like, do we have grounds to actually say, there is no God?
Yeah, you can have grounds. You can have grounds for thinking that there's no God. I mean, one of the reasons that people think you can't is that they think that, well, God is not a part of the scientifically investigable, empirically observable universe. Is kind of beyond, is behind a veil, and the stuff that's behind that veil, well, we can speculate about that, but we can never really know what's back there. It's a matter of faith. Now, I don't know if that's your view, but a lot of people take that view, and it seems to me that that's just, I mean, even some atheists take that view. I mean, at least in the weak sense of atheism, they fail to believe, but they won't go so far as to say, no, there's definitely no God back there. But I don't sign up to that view. It seems to me that even if it's true that something is unobservable, perhaps necessarily, you can still have very good evidence that it's not there. So, for example, if what's posited behind the screen would have empirically observable consequences, and then you don't observe those consequences, that's very strong evidence that it's not there. So, for example, the Templeton people spent a lot of money investigating whether petitionary prayer works on heart patients. They did a proper study, took a bunch of people, heart patients, divided them randomly into two, probably double-blinded study where some people were prayed for and other people were not. They were investigating whether there was something behind the screen that was going to help the heart patients in response to prayer. They did the study and they found wasn't there. And this wasn't just an absence of evidence for any such deity. This was evidence of absence, evidence that there is no such deity who answers people's prayers. So that's an example of scientifically investigating God claims. Had the evidence shown up, right, you can be sure that the theists would have been triumphant. Finally, we have the evidence that God is real. He's answering our prayers and we've proved it, right? But when the evidence goes the other way, it's all a mystery. We can't really know anything behind the screen. The veil of mystery is erected, and we're not allowed to know about anything back there. Well, actually, no, we can know stuff about what's back there. The distant past of this planet is unobservable, but we can know for sure that the planet is older than 6,000 years. We know that for a fact, despite the fact that it's impossible for us ever to observe its being older than that directly. We have to infer it on the basis of what we can see around us. Subatomic particles are necessarily unobservable, but we can confirm their existence, the Higgs boson, or their non-existence. So just because things are unobservable doesn't mean that they're not scientifically investigable. And in fact, the religious people themselves are very keen, very often, on scientifically investigating these things when they think that the investigation may go their way. It's only when it seems to go the other way that they suddenly get skeptical.
Yeah, I think some people would argue that God is obviously outside of scientific investigation, in the same way that, for example, morality is outside of scientific investigation. And yet we have a very strong sense or intuition of what morality is and how to behave in a moral way. And that's also not something we can investigate. So what would you say to someone that believes in God in the same way because they have an intuition of God in that same way?
It's just not true that God is not scientifically investigable. Just because he's unobservable doesn't mean he's not scientifically investigable. I mean, if you just say there's a cosmic doodah, well, it's quite difficult to, without being at all specific, it's very difficult to scientifically investigate that. But once you start adding in claims like there's an all-powerful being that's supremely benevolent and all-knowing, well, then, there are things we should start to look for.
in our case, humanism would only exclude that specific God and not, for example, a creator God that has no interest in humanity, for example.
No, we could still rule that God out. You won't be able to rule it out using the problem of evil, but there may be other ways in which you can rule it out. So certainly some God hypotheses can be ruled out from the comfort of your armchair by showing that they involve some kind of conceptual or logical confusion. I mean, if somebody says to you, I found a four-sided triangle in the jungles of Peru, you're not going to believe them, and the mathematicians are certainly not going to be mounting a very expensive expedition to go and see if it's actually there. We know that it's not there just by having a little think about it. It makes no sense. And so similarly, if somebody says, well, there's a non-temporal being that created time that's also a person, right? If it turns out that being a person is necessarily a temporal attribute, that you can't have personhood without being in time, and I think that's probably true, then the very idea of there being any kind of agent outside of time and space makes as much sense as four-sided triangles. You can know that that it's not there.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting example, because obviously triangles are defined by the number of sides, so you can ever have a four-sided triangle. But you could define a God that you can't scientifically test and that could possibly exist in the world, and you would have no way of knowing whether that God was real or not.
Well, it depends on the God hypothesis. If there's just a cosmic doodah, I've no idea what I'm supposed to be testing. If it's the claim that there's a non-temporal person, I suspect we can rule that out from the comfort of our
That doesn't have to be the claim. It could be that time did in fact exist outside of the creation moment, or it could be that God was created with the universe, or it could be that the universe itself is God, and those things are not testable.
Well, each of these hypotheses is one that we can consider, and it may be that some we can rule out from the comfort of our armchairs, and maybe that some can be ruled out empirically. Others won't be vulnerable, partly because so little has been said about them. I think one of the most irritating theistic strategies is when people say, oh, but the God that you're criticizing is not the God that I believe in. You see, I believe in a God that's an ineffable and beyond the scientifically investigable. It's a being about which nothing can be said, nothing positive, Do I rule out such a God? Well, it's quite difficult to rule out such a God because you haven't really said very much. And so that may do the trick in terms of protecting the God from being refuted. But what's irritating is that you very often find these same people then worshipping this God and expressing their gratitude towards this God. Well, why? Because they don't know that this is a being worthy of worship. They don't even know if it's a person. They haven't even said that yet. Is gratitude an appropriate attitude to have to this cosmic doodah about which we can say nothing? We have no idea. It just becomes a kind of a mysterious doodah that we can say very little about. And yet they want they still want their God that they can praise and be grateful to and so on. Well, you can't have both of those things simultaneously. And often you find that religious people engage in a sort of dance of the seven veils, where they say, I believe in God. And then you say, well, tell me about this God. And they say, well, I can't really tell you anything about it. He's a mystery. And then they say, but come on to church and we're going to praise him and be grateful to, you know. I can't really make sense of this attitude. It seems to me that they're just engaged in a kind of sleight of hand.
So it seems to me like you're fairly confident in ruling out the God of Christianity or Islam, for example. Then there are other versions of a God that could possibly exist, and they're not even worth discussing because we have no access to their reality and we wouldn't be grateful to them in any way. Is that more or less what your position?
Well, we don't really know why we should be grateful to them, or and on the face of it, there's not much reason to be grateful to a being that slaughters 50% of all human beings under the age of 5, which our creator, if he exists, has done over the 200,000 year history of human beings. I mean, you know,
it's just relocation. It's just relocation.
Relocation, yeah.
I don't think he's in on that joke.
Yeah, there's recently in apologetics discussions, it's become popular for people defending Old Testament atrocities to go with it's just relocation. And then in chats and things, while these debates have been going on, people have asked questions like, like there's some kids in my neighborhood who are struggling. Do you want to help relocating them and stuff? And those questions have been asked, and apologists haven't kind of realized what's going on. And yeah, so the relocation thing's a bit of an inside joke there.
If you were to write this book 100 years from now, let's say, or this book was to be written 100 years from now, and there was far less of a theistic bent within the UK. So let's say the trend continues to the fact that everyone became pretty much atheist, or it was a very small part of the population. Do you think how do you think the book would have changed in terms of the subject matter you would have covered? Do you think that third that was dedicated towards a position against, for instance, some kind of monotheistic God? Do you think that section of book would have changed slightly? Do you think kind of the history would have described more the last 100 years than, let's say, do you think, how do you think it would have changed in terms of your subject matter?
Well, I mean, one of the things that pulls humanists together as a community is their sense that there is some sort of injustice that needs addressing in terms of religious privilege in this country, but also in many other countries around the world, and persecution of people for their atheism or their failure to sign up to the right religion and so on. That's something that humanists are very passionate about. And the importance of getting young people educated and thinking for themselves and not just passively accepting what either a religious totalitarian authority decrees or some atheistic totalitarian authority decrees. So this kind of concern, if the world was free of religion and theocracy and so on, it wouldn't really be there anymore. So there would be much less need for any kind of campaigning humanist organization. What there would still be, I guess, is sort of maybe, I mean, an important thread to humanism is the sort of critical thinking, free thought tradition. And that could carry on very strongly, even if religion pretty much died the death and there was, political secularism everywhere. You might still think that some people are horribly prone to silly superstitious beliefs or falling for certain fallacies, and it may not have anything to do with the supernatural even. It could just be bad medicine, quack cures, stuff like that. So I imagine that, a lot of people that would currently call themselves humanists would be continuing in that kind of activity, but they would probably not really be the campaigning humanists that they are now, because many of those issues would no longer really be issues.
I see. I would see, for me, I think it's necessary to have institutions set up that allow communities together and people to chat about what we maybe term spiritual or existential questions. And so I'd like to see, for instance, Humanist UK take a more central role in that, and saying that this is a space for people who don't necessarily believe in God, but who are still interested in those questions and like to, and I suppose I would hope that in 100 years' time, that the book was that if there's an introduction to humanism, that it be referring to the fact that there is a much stronger tie between the ethical position of humanism and the wider culture and society of the UK, and that, you know, it's encouraging, and it has pillars of things like critical thinking and reflection, and helping with those existential questions that seem to always be with humanity, no matter what era we live in.
Yeah. But then that sounds an awful lot like philosophy, really, doesn't it?
It does. Apart from philosophy, I think doesn't have the compassion angle that often, it can be very dry and debate orientated. So I think it's kind of like jamming it with kind of the ethical and the loveliness and the kindness that you'd want to see from a humanist perspective.
Yeah, no, that sounds okay. I'm fully comfortable with that. Yeah.
Do you think it's necessary for the UK to have institutions? Oh, sorry, was I talking about Gigi there?
Do I think it's necessary for the UK to have institutions like that? Well, I think it's important that young people be exposed to different points of view, be encouraged to think for themselves, be encouraged to feel a sense of responsibility for making their own moral judgments and not just accepting what their parents or some other authority tells them they have to believe about morality. So I think all of that's very important. And I would be pushing for that, certainly. Even if religious belief had died the death, there could still be people that were opposed to that, just as as there are in totalitarian atheist regimes. Humanists would be profoundly opposed to Stalin and Mao, and they're not humanist figures. These are people that are against critical thinking of individuals on their own. They suppress free thought. They stop you asking the questions. So all of that, I think that's important, and I would be pushing for that. I hope that would be going on. I wrote a book about moral and religious education a few years ago called The War for Children's Minds, in which I basically say, that's what we need. We need that kind of moral and religious education. But of course, I was also opposed to traditional religious education, which suggests children just need to shut up and listen to what the experts tell them about.
It's an easy way of teaching.
Just algorithmically assign them grades. It's easy.
Well, it would be from genetics.
What's a question I wanted to ask? You promoted the virtue of philosophical education over religious education, humanism. What would that look like over the course of a child's entire education? Like, how young, ideally, would you want them to start?
Oh, well, there are organizations that already are promoting philosophy for children, or P4C, as it's often known now, P4C, philosophy for children. You find that going on in schools up and down the UK and around the world, and there are organisations promoting it and training people in how to do it, such as Sapere, S-A-P-E-R-E. Sapere, why Sapere? Well, Kant, when he was asked what is enlightenment, said it's the courage to think for yourself. Sapere aude, dare to think, dare to question, right? So there's a lot of that going on in schools, and there's a lot of empirical evidence that when that's going on in schools, not only do the kids become measurably more intelligent, bizarrely, 6 percentage points after 2 hours a week of just being encouraged to think and question. They also have less bullying. The culture in the school is better. The discussions that are had influence the whole curriculum and make teaching and learning that much more positive. What is it that they're doing? It's not learning about what Kant said or Hume said or whatever. It's getting into a circle and discussing things openly and critically and being allowed to question and apply your intelligence, often on questions that they have themselves chosen. That's what people mean by P4C. So I think that kind of thing is what we should be doing in schools. There's a lot of it. Even Ofsted in the UK, the organisation that's charged with looking at schools and assessing how well they're teaching their kids. Even Ofsted has picked up on the fact that P4C is really, really effective, not just in terms of making kids smarter, but in making them more well-rounded, emotionally mature, more compassionate individuals. So, yeah, so I'm very much behind the sort of P4C initiative, and it's what I'm promoting in that book, The War for Children's Minds.
Do you know about like any of those initiatives? You mentioned in the UK, of course, because that's where you're from, but I didn't know about it. Where can I find more information about that in the US?
Oh, well, it goes on in the US. There were some of the key figures behind it were Americans. There was a guy called Matthew Lipman who sort of started Sapere, did he? I can't remember. A lot of the early work was done by Americans. Sapere is an international organization. There are plenty of Americans involved. If you're interested in that kind of thing, you should contact SAPERE, Sapere, which has branches, around the world. And they provide materials, training, advice. That would be my suggestion. I mean, I'm not a qualified teacher, and I can pontificate on this, but if you want people that will really teach you how to do it and know what they're talking about, there are plenty of people that know a lot more about it than me, and I would talk to them, get in touch with them.
I wanted. Oh,
sorry.
In the US, the acronym you gave me.
I couldn't hear that. Sorry.
She was asking about the acronym P4C. Could you expand that for us?
P, philosophy, 4, C, children. P4C, philosophy for children.
In the US, what was the other one?
Sapere, SAPERE. Sapere. If you Google P4C and Sapere, you'll just find a ton of stuff, links and websites, and you can get in contact with those people.
I have a question from the audience. Flash asks, does the privation theory of evil pose a problem for the evil God challenge? And privation would just be that evil is just the lack of good, like darkness is the lack of light.
Yeah, the answer is no.
Thank you.
The reason, so the privation view of evil is that, yeah, as you say, evil is a kind of absence. It's a bit more complicated. So the classic, illustration would be, well, blindness is an evil, and it consists in an absence of sight, which is something that you ought to have as a human being. There's something that should be there, but it's missing. That's what a privation is. It's not the fact that bricks don't have sight. That's not a privation, because bricks are not supposed to have it. It's something missing that ought to be or is supposed to be there. And the idea then is that evil in the world is an absence of this sort, a kind of privation. But why is that any kind of solution to the evidential problem of evil? Well, it isn't really, is it? I mean, you're just relabeling the pain and suffering. The fact is, there is horrific pain and suffering. There are children dying horrifically. You can say, oh, that's just an absence of good, or that's just a privation. But the fact is, it's absolutely gut-wrenchingly appalling, and no all-powerful, all-good God would allow it. I mean, they may allow some little holes in the Swiss cheese of existence, but these vast gaping chasms of appalling suffering, why are they there? That question has not been dealt with by the privation view of evil. All that it's done is it's relabeled the problem. It's now become the problem of, you know, the vast gaping holes, the absence. The absences are still just as appallingly awful, and we still need an explanation for why an all-powerful and supremely benevolent deity would allow them. The problem has not gone away. So I think merely introducing the privation view of evil, it's no solution to the problem of evil at all. I don't think most theists that are, you know, philosopher theists think that it is, for the most part.
Would it destroy the symmetry of the all good and powerful God or the all evil and powerful God? The privation theory of evil would say that the all evil God makes no sense, because what is there the thing that is the absence of?
Yeah, it's like the Swiss cheese. It would be a Swiss cheese. It's all whole and no cheese. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, is there? So an evil God is a nonsensical hypothesis. It makes no sense. There couldn't be an all evil God. You can rule that out from the comfort of your armchair, logically. And so there's a kind of asymmetry between the good God hypothesis and the evil God hypothesis, given that the privation view is correct. Yeah, you could try that, but it doesn't really help though with the evidential problem of evil, insofar as the evidential problem of evil is saying, but you would rule out an evil God on the basis of observed goods, notwithstanding the fact that the very idea of such a God doesn't make sense. If you would rule it out anyway, given just the sheer quantity of good that exists in the universe, then by parity of reasoning, you should rule out a good God given the observed evils in exactly the same way. So that challenge is not actually dealt with by pointing to the privation view of evil and the fact that, yeah, the very idea of an evil God may not make any sense. I can still run my evil God challenge. In any case, the privation view of evil is not, I mean, no non-theist signs up to it, and even many theists reject it because it's pretty obviously not true. There's more to evil than just an absence of something. It works quite well, the privation view, for certain examples like blindness. But then other times it seems more appropriate to say that good is a privation of evil. I mean, what is peace? Well, it's an absence of war and strife and famine. And see, it's an absence of evil. That's what a good is. It depends which examples you pick. Sometimes goods look like privations of evils. Sometimes evils look like privations of goods. What's the truth? Which is a privation of, well, the truth is that neither of these positions is actually correct. I think that's probably the right thing to say. Yeah, anyway, privation view of evil, no solution whatsoever to the evidential problem of evil, so far as I can see.
Mark, did you want to ask your question that you put in the chat?
Yeah, so let me remember what it is. What is the status of morality in a godless world? Does moral nihilism logically follow from a non-theistic worldview?
I don't think so. I mean, it's a so the moral argument for the existence of God. I mean, a simple version of which would be something like, you know, morality exists objectively. If there is no God, then morality wouldn't exist objectively. Therefore, there must be a God. That's a sort of simple theistic argument for theism. That kind of argument is very, very popular with Christian apologists and evangelists. It's I think William Lane Craig once said, it may not be the best argument for the existence of God, but boy, you know, it punches above its weight when it comes to sheer rhetorical power. I mean, people are moved by that one in a way that they tend not to be moved by some of the others, despite the fact that it's not even a very good argument, perhaps. Well, he wouldn't say that, but so I think that, you know, most Richard Swinburne doesn't think much of it. the moral argument for the existence of God. Plenty of religious philosophers don't think much of it. They're not persuaded that you can't have objective moral truths in the absence of the Judeo-Christian God. And I think the vast majority of philosophers working on morality, I mean, they're not theists, but they don't think that, they don't all think that morality is just a fiction, a nonsense. But still, it might be. And actually, I don't rule it out personally. Maybe there really is no such thing as objective moral truth. I very much would like it to be true that there is. I feel in my bones that it's there, but maybe I'm wrong. So it's not, for me, it's not a deal breaker. And I characterized humanism in such a way that although most humanists do sign up to a kind of objective moral truth, it's not absolutely a requirement. And you can still say that even if nothing matters objectively, things can still matter a lot to us. Indeed, they will continue to matter a great deal to us. It matters a lot to us that people don't starve and people's welfare is looked after. And of course, it's also true that if nothing matters, then it doesn't matter. Then nothing matters.
I had a question similarly along the sort of moral lines that people kind of argue about gods and so forth. Was you addressed something about moral capital in the Humanism book, but I think the way some I was going to say, I think the way some apologists have approached this has also changed slightly with figures like, for example, Jordan Peterson becoming popular, or Tom Holland, who's written a book called Dominion, where a lot of the arguments in that are essentially that humanists or atheists borrow from the Christian worldview, or at least historically owe all the foundations of their thought to Christianity in some sense. And I was wondering what your thoughts were around that kind of argumentation.
Well, I haven't read Tom Holland's book. I probably should. And of course, you can make as a historian, which I am not, you might be able to make a case for saying that much of what we sign up to as humanists, morally speaking, has its roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition. That might be true. But of course, that doesn't immediately follow that you can't continue to have that kind of morality in the absence of the tradition from which it came. That doesn't follow at all. You would need a pretty strong argument along those lines before you could conclude that humanists have to either become Christian or abandon their morality, which is presumably where these guys are headed. And of course, it's true that Christianity itself drew on non-Christian sources. A great deal of Christian morality draws on, Greek philosophy. Indeed, the Judeo-Christian God is as much an ancient Greek creation as he is something that you would find in the Old Testament. The God of the philosophers is a philosopher's invention. And you find him emerging in the work of people like Plato and Aristotle. That's the truth, not in the Old Testament. So obviously you find this back and forth from religious to non-religious influence taking place. I've no doubt that a lot of that has gone on, but of course it doesn't follow that if your moral views now as an atheist had their roots in religious thinking, that they're not capable of standing on their own 2 feet in the absence of that religious tradition. However, I'm sure that Tom Holland and other people have got fantastically persuasive looking arguments for why you really can't have the later morality in the absence of the Christian foundations. But I'd have to see the arguments before I could start chipping at them. It's an interesting way to go. I mean, just to rewind 5 minutes, I was saying that possibly I'm a moral nihilist. Some days I'm thinking I'm not entirely sure there really is this thing called morality.
Is that more of a because you also said you really sort of feel in your bones it is true in it. Maybe I often say in that just almost just as certain as I am of the physical external world in front of me and the table in front of me, I'm as certain it's all, and it's kind of a skeptical challenge of, well, it would be possible to have that appearance with being the actual what's going on underneath being very different. Is that but actually you sort of believe that moral realism is true in a sense? Or I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I'm very confused about morality, to be perfectly honest. I think that's fine. I think you're allowed to be. I'm not sure what I think about it, but I lean a bit in the direction of it could well be a kind of an illusion. There is a kind of error involved. I have some time for that view, I have to admit. But at the same time, it really seems to me that things are objectively morally right or wrong. Now, what would it take for me to give up that seeming? Well, just a really good argument that, appearances are misleading. And of course they are. It really seems to me that the Earth is not, that I'm not flying along at immense speed and the Earth is rotating. Doesn't really feel that way. It doesn't seem to me to be true. It seems to me that I'm stationary. It seems to me that the Earth is stationary. That it really, really, really seems that way to me. And yet the fact is that I don't believe that anymore, because I've seen really, really good arguments that it can't possibly be true. And so much the same way, it might really, really seem to me that there are these objective moral facts. But if we can both show that if there were such facts that they would be unknowable, and perhaps also that they couldn't possibly be such facts, and perhaps we can also explain why it would seem to me that there are such facts, even if there weren't such facts. If you've got all of that on the table, it's going to be pretty difficult to maintain the view that there are objective moral facts. Sorry.
How does that relate in terms of humanism? Because humanism is saying, is at the core of it an ethical position about what we should care about. And in your mind, are you saying it doesn't matter in your head whether morality is real or not? In a sense, this ethical position is still important.
Well, I think for most humanists, if it turned out, if they were suddenly to be convinced overnight that, oh dear, morality is a kind of fiction, they're not going to be outside, raping and killing and murdering and doing whatever the hell they feel like. No, in fact, they'll still carry on doing all the good stuff that they did before. I don't think that's going to change at all. Things will still matter to them. It will still matter to them that they live in a society in which people don't suffer unnecessarily and so on. They'll continue to do the stuff that they always did, is my guess. I'm not sure that. No, I'll leave it there.
I suppose it's whether. Sorry, go ahead.
You first, Harry.
I've done my bit. Juggling, go.
Okay, I'm following up on yours. Do humanists agree with each other about morality more or less than their theist counterparts?
That's a really good question. I would guess less, because there's such a huge range of opinion on things like, assisted dying and abortion, and you find religious people that think that the races should be separate, and then you find religious people who think that's just racist nonsense and so on. I mean, there's barely a moral issue on which you won't find two profoundly opposed religious perspectives, whereas don't get nearly that range within humanist thought. You may find that there are humanists, most humanists believe in assisted dying, but one or two don't. And most will believe in abortion on demand, but there are one or two exceptions to that. But I think there's probably much more of a consensus, I'm guessing. Again, this is an empirical question. But that, without going and doing a little bit of research, I'm not sure what the answer is, but I'm fairly confident that you're going to get less divergence of opinion when it comes to morality looking at the humanists than if you were to look at all religions as a whole. You get more divergence there. I mean, some believe in human sacrifice and some don't. Some, yeah, I mean, they're just a very diverse bunch, religions.
Have you got any more questions, Juggling? In terms, I know that you had a list of questions.
I do, and I'm not sure I want to extend, but I'll throw one more at least. Does the typical humanist's antipathy? No, they going against. Sorry, I don't know why I'm having a hard time saying this. Antipathy toward religion help or hinder the acceptance of humanism as a viable alternative to religion as a moral strategy? Do you think humanists, because we tend to be anti-religious, are causing our own speed bump?
I don't think we have any choice but to point out that we don't buy religion, because that feeds into our attitudes towards theocracy and church-state separation and moral thinking and so on. So you have to set out your stall. There are different ways in which you can do that. You don't have to be particularly aggressive in the way that you do it. So are you thinking that perhaps somebody like, I mean, Richard Dawkins is obviously often blamed for being particularly antagonistic and saying things that are kind of designed to wind up religious people and perhaps humanists.
Yeah, Harry and I are very into street epistemology, which is very much the opposite side from Richard Dawkins. I agree with Dawkins on almost everything, except when to argue. And street epistemology is the anti-arguing method. So that's kind of where my question is coming from.
Yeah, no, I have nothing wrong with this street epistemology. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I do agree with Richard Dawkins about is that we're expected to show a kind of respect when it comes to religious beliefs that no other belief merits. And it's difficult to see why religious belief should be accorded this very special respect. You know, if somebody has political views that you disagree with, well, you can just say, well, that's nonsense. You know, I disagree with that. What a load of rubbish. This is why. But if you adopt that kind of tone with a religious person, they will be deeply offended. And it's hard to know why that response is justified. In fact, I don't think that it is justified. I think that there's a kind of respect that religion has traditionally enjoyed, where we all doff our caps and show our respect to the religious person. And they're just not used to religious people. People just treating religious belief like any other kind of belief that people may happen to have. And so it sounds to them, to their ears, it sounds as if you're being deliberately obnoxious and aggressive and so on, even when all you're doing is just talking in a sort of matter-of-fact, knockabout way about their beliefs in the same way that you would unthinkingly do, you know, talk about political beliefs or whatever it might happen to be. So I don't believe that religion is due any special respect, that religious beliefs are due any special privilege in that way. Or if they are, I don't yet know what the argument for that would be. I mean, what's particularly interesting is that very often religious beliefs are political beliefs. I mean, attitudes towards women, attitudes toward gay people, attitudes towards the state of Israel, attitudes towards, charitable giving and looking after those less fortunate. These are all highly political views. When they come in a religious outfit, we're all supposed to be terribly careful about how we put things and what we say and not cause offense. But take the religious stuff away and suddenly, no, you can just talk about these things openly and honestly and without fear of pissing people off or upsetting people. I don't understand why adding a little sprinkling of religious fairy dust to a belief means that we should accord it any more respect than we would other beliefs. Have I answered your question? I think I have, yeah.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
But that point's been made by Richard Dawkins and loads of other people. I mean, it's not mine.
I suppose humanism provides that other place for people to go as a contrast, so that to help with that realization that you can think about these things outside of a religious context, and then if you can think of them from outside a religious context, then you can also think of them as maybe as other things, as maybe actually as political questions or just an ethical question on the face of it. It's not necessarily connected, doesn't have to be connected to a religious answer, and so it opens the door to get away from religiosity in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. In fact, I would add, in terms of the causing offence concern, I would add that actually sometimes it's reasonable to go out of your way to be a little bit offensive. That might sound odd, but the reason for it is that it can have a kind of a shocking effect on the person that you're having the conversation with. That can just allow for them to see things in a different way momentarily. So it's the story of the king's invisible outfit, isn't it? The emperor's new clothes. Everyone's paying respect to the king, and no one can see the clothes, but everyone's pretending that the clothes are there, and no one's daring to say anything, and we're showing our respect. And then one kid laughs, and suddenly the spell is broken, and suddenly they all start laughing. Suddenly they can all see what complete morons they've been. But it took somebody to point the finger and laugh to break the spell. And again, loads of people have made this point. It's a good point, I think, that sometimes, to break the spell that religion and other belief systems cast over us, it's not inappropriate to just, take the mickey a bit.
It's funny because I think that, and Juggling's mentioned this before, where we come from a school of thought where the most effective method, on average, would be one which is kind of softly, one that is based out of building bridges over time, and then respect over time, that then allows people to retreat back from initially very entrenched views if they wish to, if they feel like it's appropriate for them to do so. So you mimic what you believe is good rational behavior. So you say when you don't understand things, you back down from positions if they don't seem to be viable empirically, etc., etc. It's a constant debate amongst kind of people who do street epistemologies when, like you said, when is there actually a time in which this softly approach is ineffective, and instead you switch to that kind of taking the mick mode. And my understanding was that from a psychological perspective, it gets people to double down more often than it gets people to.
Maybe. Yeah. It's a good question. Exactly. What's the most effective thing to do? There's an upside and a downside to both approaches. If you do the respect and then they'll begin to get the impression that theirs is an intellectually credible position that you respect intellectually, when in fact you really don't. But you're having to pretend that you do, and they'll feed off that, and it will allow them to feel that much more secure in what they believe. And so the pointing the finger and laughing a bit will quickly dispel that. On the other hand, pointing and laughing, as you say, may just get their backs up and bring down the shutters.
I think it works within, is this Haidt's moral research? It works within in-group. So taking the mick works if you're already part of their accepted group. That tends to pull people in line a bit or get people to immediately.
Right. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. That's very interesting. Right, good. I can see that makes sense. It's a balance, obviously. Good. I should read about that. Haidt has written on it.
Jonathan Haidt, he's written The Righteous Mind, and I think it's the happiness hypothesis, or he's written a bunch of stuff. He researches morality and
I know about him, but I hadn't come across that point. It's an interest. It's good.
Yeah, I think that point's in The Righteous Mind, or somewhere in his works. I think it's all a bit one of them. Yeah.
I should go and read that now.
Are you okay for time, by the way?
I should probably wrap it up in the next 5 minutes or so, just because I've got to go and cook tea and stuff. But yeah, let's have another question or two.
I've got a question, unless other people, or Nathan, have you got questions from the audience or anything? No. If you were to extend this book into a much larger volume, what chapters would you add to it?
Oh God, I'm really going to struggle with that question, I think.
Just to remind you, do you want me to read out some of your chapters, or are you okay with?
I barely remember what's in the book.
Yeah, okay. So you did. So you've got the history of humanism, arguments for the existence of God, arguments against the existence of God, humanism and morality, humanism and secularism, humanism and moral and religious education, the meaning of life, which you managed to cover in only 15 pages, which is very impressive considering it's the meaning of life, and then humanist ceremonies. Those were kind of the 8 chapters.
Yeah, I can't think off the top of my head. The minute this finishes, I'll think of something. But off the top of my head, I can't think of another whole topic area.
Maybe they'd all just get chunkier.
I think that's what. Yeah, I think that's right. I would just do more work within. So clearly, the meaning of life is a little bit sketchy.
I love that. It's like an afterthought at the end of the book. It's like the meaning of life. Here it is, just for 10 pages.
Got that covered. Yeah.
You don't need to devote a whole book to that. Just a chapter. Yeah. Because I thought that those were, to me, it feels like they covered a lot of the grounds of humanism, and those 8 sections, but like obviously they're very short, so I could see how you could puff those out into much larger.
Yes, and other people have done it. I mean, there have other people who've written books on humanism that are much more substantial and go into these things in rather more.
What would you recommend?
Detail. Richard Norman is a very good philosopher, and he works in ethics. He's an ethicist, and so he's worth checking out. I'm pretty sure he wrote a book on humanism that's still in print, and it would be worth looking at that.
On humanism, I guess that one.
Yeah, I think that's So, and he's much more knowledgeable about moral philosophy. I'm not a moral philosopher. I've never really done any research in that area or published any papers or anything, but he has. So he would be much sharper on that side of things. And certainly that would benefit from being explored much more than it is in my book. So clearly it's a very, very short introduction, and it's necessarily a fairly sketchy treatment. I think people often assume that there is a humanist morality, and then they want to know what it is. And that's just a mistake. There isn't one. I mean, it's a bit like saying, what's the religious morality? Or even, what's the Christian morality? Well, I mean, there's divine command theory, there's this view on ethics. There are many different views that you can take. And they
are unified by the fact that the human is the central theme within, just like I suppose within religious, it would be within religious moral doctrine, it would be about the deity or the supernatural beings.
So you could explore in much more detail the various different ways of thinking about morality that you find under the humanist umbrella. You could do that and include, more thinkers and their different perspectives. That would be interesting to do. I don't really do that in the book. I didn't have time. Yeah.
Have you any thoughts as well just on how humanists can avoid what you see as some of the pitfalls of religion? So presumably, seeing religion from a naturalist perspective, it's essentially when primates like us gather in groups and enshrine our values and stuff like that. So lots of the shortcomings of organized religion would also be available to a secular group that was organized around it. So how can humanists avoid some of those sort of whether it's like tribal thinking or likelihood to accept things just because an authority figure told you them?
Well, critical thinking. We can only hope that by encouraging that and getting people into the habit of doing it, that'll give them some immunity. I'm not entirely convinced that's true. But what else are you going to do? I think that's probably our best bet. I thought for a minute you wanted to talk about, the Sunday assembly and the quasi-religious package that you sometimes find associated with humanism, because in the past humanists have had their own sort of quasi-religious ceremonies and I'm trying to remember it's gone out of my head, but there's an awful lot of quasi-religious stuff that humanists have historically gone in for. I think particularly in France, and some humanists think that's a bad thing, and that we shouldn't be aping religion at all. We shouldn't be coming together on a Sunday and singing songs. This is just a big mistake. We're just trying to be religious by the back door. But actually, I couldn't care less, frankly, if people do that or not. If it makes people happy, why not? I mean, there's nothing wrong with a bit of tradition and a bit of pomp and circumstance and dressing up and singing. It's all good, as long as you're not allowing it to, as long as you're aware of what effect it's having on your own psychology and the pitfalls that there are, the way in which you can get sucked in down some dark alleyways by people pressing those emotional buttons in that kind of way. As long as you know that and you're aware that it can be going on, I don't really have a problem with people getting together on Sundays and having a good old sing song and a thought for the day. I mean, why not? Seems okay to me.
I would say it's almost a necessity if Humanists UK want this particular moral and political position to spread throughout the UK. It needs to be imbibed kind of physically, so in person with in-person groups and chats and ideas. Whether that's on Sunday or not, another question. But to kind of institutionalize itself in that manner in order for it to spread and have influence. Because I think that you're never going to be able to, because it deals with such important questions, and these questions have always been codified in that manner, whether it be meeting in a certain place or having a specialized place to discuss these questions. It seems to me that that's how we get things to stay historically and stop fading over time.
Yeah, as long as people are genuinely having the open discussions, I think that's a good and healthy thing. It's when you merely pay lip service to that, and actually what you're really doing is you're just kind of entrenching belief, and there's a kind of understood limit to the range of questions that can be asked. So, for example, on the back of buses in the UK for a while now, we've had big posters that say an opportunity to explore the meaning of life, which sounds great, doesn't it? I mean, you know, if you're a bit philosophically inclined, you're going to think, this is great. I can get together with like-minded individuals and engage in a free back and forth, exploring these big questions. This is it. I'm going to sign up for this.
Yeah.
Well, what you've just signed up for is the Alpha course. At the end of which, you're supposed to speak in tongues.
I was going to say, I have a friend who, well, I don't know if he'd class me as a friend now since I deconverted from the cult I was sort of dragged into, but he said he was forced to speak in tongues at the end of the Alpha course. And I thought, he was like, but it was very bizarre because he was like, I'm not sure, you know, because we were fundamentalist kind of Calvinists, so you know those gifts of the Spirit aren't around anymore. But he was like, but at the end of the Alpha course, I'm not sure if it happened or not. And there was this kind of cognitive dissonance between the theology of people like John Piper and stuff saying, well, the gifts of the Spirit aren't around, and the Alpha course that brought him into it having like you know, that, well, these things do exist, of course, you know, God can do whatever.
Yeah. So sometimes, you know, you can be paying lip service to free thought and exploring ideas, but the truth is you're not really doing that at all. You're doing something else. And so you could easily find humanists drifting into that by accident. And obviously I wouldn't approve of that. Yeah.
No. You'd have to keep the core tenets, like you said, of critical thinking, of a really good epistemology. So of the tribal, like adhering to the tribe means that you don't adhere to just facts on authority, but instead of checking whether, you know, things are true or not. And yeah. I suppose there's this wider question of whether it should, I don't know what your opinion is as a philosopher about whether philosophy should be taken down from the ivory tower, so to speak, and spread much more into schools, let's say, as more of a kind of a Hellenistic Greek tradition, or whether, you know, actually we're seeing more of this pop culture movement now where it's the center of the plate for philosophy should be much more about what people are doing in their everyday lives and how this contributes to them flourishing and the community flourishing, rather than to wider kind of esoteric questions.
Well, I think there's room for both. I mean, I published really quite dry, technically, you know, complicated papers in analysis and things like that. But but at the same time, you know, I've written children's books that have introduced philosophy. So I think you can do all of this stuff if you wish. It's all good. I slightly disapprove of the sort of Alain de Botton approach, I have to admit.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Partly because he treated, it seemed to me, I mean, maybe this is not fair and you should talk to him about it, but when he published the Consolations of Philosophy, it seemed to me that he was presenting a series of philosophers and their ideas as if they were kind of sweets in a sweet shop, or better, medicines in a medicine cabinet, and you could select whichever one worked for you, whichever one makes you feel better, whichever one consoles you. But the fact is that they were contradictory. I mean, if this one's true, that one's not true, right? They can't all be. So, but there was it wasn't the truth that was of interest. It was, how is this going to help me? How am I going to feel better as a result of and it seems to me that that is not philosophy. Philosophy is not here to make you feel better. It might make you feel worse. Philosophy is here to reveal the truth. And sometimes the truth is a bitch. And it is not what you want to hear, right? And it's not going to console you. It's not going to make you feel better. So you must never, ever lose sight of the fact that philosophy is fundamentally about figuring out as best we can what is true. And it seems to me that some attempts at turning philosophy into a branch of the self-help industry have gone a bit too far. Have begun to lose sight of the fact that actually truth is what matters most of all.
I suppose I'm one of those. I love School of Life, and I think I would like to see different versions of it that have a slightly different take, or I'd like to see that kind of idea, those kinds of ideas have more competition, and, you know, to see it spread in a similar kind of pop culture fashion. And I think that the truth, I find that when thinking about philosophy and wisdom, I see science as revealing difficult truths, and then I see philosophy as taking those truths and turning them into something that's useful within the everyday. But I understand that, you know, there's different ways of codifying and thinking about these things.
Handmaiden to the sciences, is that what you're saying?
Something along those lines, yeah.
I think that philosophy can reveal truths, can figure out the answers to questions, can provide solutions to puzzles. It's not just a matter of what works for you or what feels good or, you know, what allows you to thrive and prosper. I mean, yes, there are bits of, you know, the Stoics, obviously, some good tips for, you know, living life well in there. But, you know, fundamentally, what we're interested in is what's true. Is it true that morality is an illusion? Is it true that when we're dead, we're dead? Is it true that there's something immaterial about people? So to some extent, I mean, people often think, well, you'll never figure out the answers to these questions, but the fact is we do. We have made progress. There are puzzles that have been solved. I do think that the question of the existence of the Judeo-Christian God is settled. I know the question, I know the debate rumbles on, but then the debate about the age of the universe rumbles on. People still banging on about it being 6,000 years old. And some of them have got PhDs. But the mere fact that a conversation continues like that doesn't mean that the argument wasn't settled some time ago. And I think the argument about God was settled some time ago. I think it's a done deal. But yeah, even if you didn't agree with that, right, I think there are other questions where philosophy can at least show that certain answers can't possibly be right, and maybe do better than that.
And my understanding of the consolationist philosophy, which is also, I'm a big Alain de Botton fan, so I will defend him. But is that the idea is that he was just like his book Religion for Atheists. It was this idea that you can find really cool tools and important and helpful tools within the broad set of philosophies that are not related to religious doctrine. And also religious doctrine could be treated just like any other philosophy, and in which case you can take the baby out from the bathwater and figure out and use that to your advantage. And I suppose for me, it was one of the first philosophy books I ever read, and it then encouraged me to then go and read about Epicureanism and about Stoicism and pessimism and kind of, you know, the classic Socratic dialogue and things like that. So maybe it's not as rigorous as academic philosophy is can be, but it certainly, for me, I felt like it was a great vehicle to introduce me to kind of to philosophy as a whole.
Yeah, well, good. Yeah, I don't want to do Alain de Botton down, but I just I had that concern that, you know, it was what works for you, what feels good, not what's true.
Yeah,
I'm more interested in what's true.
Yeah. I get the impression that it's about running with what is. So we got what's true, and then how can we use that to effectively live good lives? Is the jump that they're trying to make. So although they may be kind of more on how to live a good life, they try and extrapolate from what is true from that, and they are informed by what is true, and then they try and turn that into something that is helpful.
Yeah. Good. Well, I reckon I probably leave you guys now because I've got stuff to do with the family. So, but thank you very much for having the conversation. It was very.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you for reading the book.
Thank you for writing it.
It was good to discover that somebody's actually read the bloody thing. So right. Yeah, so good luck with it. And what are you going to do next? What's the next book?
Factfulness by Hans Rosling.
Oh, great. Good.
Have you read that one?
No, but I imagine that will be very interesting. Yeah. Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And
thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Good luck with it all.
Yeah, have a good weekend.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll end the stream there then as well. For everyone watching, thank you for watching. Hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have, then leave a like, or if you're new here and you want to see more conversations like this, then subscribe. Thank you.